Well, once again, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Andy Neale. I'm the Deputy Chief Executive here at the Parliamentary Counsel office in New Zealand. And yeah, really happy to be talking with you about our modernisation efforts. As I've only got 10 minutes, I will, of course, perhaps just focus on the digital modernisation efforts of our drafting and publishing processes. I think just to set the context, though, a brief introduction to our work. So the Parliamentary Counsel office here in New Zealand is our law and drafting and publication office. It's the government's legislative advisor, and we exercise stewardship of New Zealand's legislation as a whole. And as I mentioned in the previous session, we work towards great law in New Zealand, making sure it's accessible, fit for purpose, and constitutionally sound. If you ever visit Wellington, New Zealand, you ever see our Parliament buildings here. Our process for producing legislation is no doubt similar to many other jurisdictions. We draft, edit, and still print bills before they're reviewed by our standing committee, which is in New Zealand, those are select committees. And then, the drafts are, of course, often amended throughout the process of review by us before ultimately being published, if passed, into law. So in terms of modernisation, as a whole, we have three strategic priorities. Firstly, to enhance our ability to sustainably deliver better designed legislation. Secondly, to strengthen our system leadership and influence. And thirdly, to reimagine the access and use of legislation. So in the short time I've got today, I'm going to speak a bit more about detail about priorities 1 and 3. So I spoke on the panel just now about some of my ideas about AI in the drafting process, but in fact, you won't hear a lot about AI in our modernisation efforts. And the simple explanation for this is that we just don't want to rush into it. We have ideas, perhaps like many of you, but we also have a lot to learn first. What we do have is a staff working group that's exploring how new technologies might augment staff capabilities. Certainly, there's the possibility to semi-automate some tasks or reduce staff workload or improve quality. But I think I would simply say there's opportunity for further investment here in the future. So I think onto the first area of digital modernisation, I want to talk about how to enhance our ability to sustainably deliver better designed legislation. And I thought I'd just start very quickly by giving you an overview of the current state of our drafting and publishing system. We draft in an XML editor called Arbortext. XML is stored in a document management system, currently Documentum. We have a paper-based editing and proofreading process. We do manual consolidations. We validate the XML against a schema. And then we transform the XML of the drafts of the bills into PDFs and into HTML before publishing those on legislation.gov.nz, our access website. So, in terms of where we're looking to invest, look, here are some of the areas we're currently considering for modernisation, and these are all in different stages of work. Some of them are at the early stage of consideration. Some of them are a bit further ahead in terms of looking at actual solutions and potentially starting up projects. So I'll just go through these fairly quickly. It might sound a little surprising to see security listed as the first area of modernization, but this is, simply to say that protecting the information that we are responsible for is absolutely critical. There are other areas in the drafting system where we can improve things, but we need to continually stay on top of this. This is critical for maintaining the trust of our stakeholders and trust in the democratic system. So it's really, really important to us. Revision tracking is probably one of the biggest opportunities we see right now for efficiency gains. So the purpose of revision tracking is to see acts marked up with proposed amendments, and actually for that marked up act to actually be introduced and passed as a bill, instead of parliamentarians just seeing the amendment. They would see the principal act tracked with proposed changes. Perhaps some of you are already doing this, and I'd love to talk with you if you are, but this would be a big step for us. One of the interesting aspects of revision tracking is that if Parliament accepted a revision tracked bill, then the consolidation process would be semi-automated because the amendments are already in the Act. So this is a kind of an add-on that we're particularly interested in exploring. Collaborative drafting. Simply to say that we're interested in drafting systems where staff and officials might contribute to the same document at the same time. If you think about a commenting type arrangement, instead of us emailing attachments around government departments and so on, there's an opportunity to rethink how this interaction might work. The one nod to AI here is our interest in developing tools that can suggest improvements to drafts. So the kind of things that we're looking at are the use of standard clauses. So a drafter is working through a draft, and there might be a suggestion or a detection that there's an opportunity to use a standard clause. And also suggesting plain language edits. As I said, we've got editors, but we know that there are systems out in the wild now that can actually provide really good support for plain language editing, and we're interested in that. In terms of our, how we go about digital modernization, there's nothing revolutionary in our process. It starts with a business insight. Like with the difficulty in someone understanding the impact of an amendment when it's unconsolidated. We'll then experiment with different options before developing a proof of concept to test with staff. There's, of course, a lot more that I could say about this, but just in the time I've got, I wanted to mention the approach that we have. Second area of digital modernization to talk about just briefly is how we plan to reimagine the access and use of legislation. So there's a whole other presentation in just this one slide, but essentially we see that good access to legislation has 10 properties that indicate it can be used widely. And that's really all driven by a user-centered focus in the middle here. Are we using plain language? So is it understandable? Is there a complete record of all current and obsolete legislation and regulation? Is it freely available? Is it accessible to those with impairments? is it reaching the people who need it the most? So, there's a question of equitable access here. Are people sure about what they're seeing? So is it trustworthy and certain? Is it findable, and so on? We've got modernisation efforts kind of exploring all of these properties. But just in the interest of time, I think I'll just speak a little bit more to the last three here. And that's in terms of the data properties of legislation, which I think underpin a lot of our aspirations for the future. So is it interoperable? Is it connected? And is it reusable? So I'm just going to go through a couple of points here. Again, I don't think any of these are revolutionary. They're things which we're exploring. It gives you the context of how we're approaching things here in New Zealand. It's an interesting package, perhaps, to see. So first up, legal standards. I think that if we all mapped our legislation to an international standard, we could benefit from shared technology solutions, aid the understanding of international law and support harmonisation efforts. Akoma Ntosa and the legal doc ML standard are kind of the example here. I'm really interested in adopting controlled vocabularies, and it's the idea of using standardized terms in the metadata that describes the legislation. And this is really about providing new ways to navigate and find legislation, providing better support and better tools for legal research and analysis. So, one of the ideas that we're looking at is adopting the Eurovoc classification system from the European Union, for example. We can further enrich metadata by adding new terms to the legislation. So, for example, we can use techniques like natural language processing to identify and extract a whole range of data. So we can identify professions across legislation, place names, organizations, historical dates. I even came across an example of identifying all the physical objects that are mentioned in legislation. And there are a lot of different use cases here that can help people with their use of legislation. And this information can be added to the metadata to provide kind of novel ways to query and navigate the legislation. Developing a knowledge graph is something that's particularly interesting for me right now. As some of you will know, a knowledge graph is a way of capturing the relationships between pieces of information, in our case, pieces of letgislation. And the benefits include being able to provide a visual way to navigate and find legislation and letting users kind of follow connections to support, I think, more advanced legal research needs. But there's a really interesting field of research here that looks to combine knowledge graphs with large language models to provide better AI services. And I think knowledge graphs for legislation could be quite important for future AI services. And then coming to the end here, we're also exploring the release of an application programming interface, perhaps adapting the Open API standard. And I think by providing real-time access to legislative changes, we can actually encourage innovation with third-party developers and third-party services. We produce the legislation, but we want to encourage other people to take advantage of it so that we can see a better ecosystem for law and justice in New Zealand. And then lastly, we want to explore the the idea of hierarchical identifiers. So for example, in our legislation, if each clause in each piece of legislation had its own identifier or reference, that would provide a number of benefits, including more accurate citations and cross-referencing, and better integration with legal databases and research tools. And just to close out here again, this same development model, moving from business insights to experiments, is the way which we're looking at supporting that reimagination of access. So there's a lot to unpack here in just 10 minutes, a short amount of time, but I hope that gives you some insight into some of the areas of modernisation that we're looking into. Thank you.